Here is something no one thought to document until it was already gone. Between roughly 1870 and 1910, in cities across Europe, North America, South America, and the colonial territories of Africa and Asia, the original freshwater infrastructure of the pre-industrial world was systematically dismantled, not upgraded, not expanded, dismantled. The stone aqueducts, the gravity-fed cistern networks, the elaborate subterranean channel systems, the public fountain complexes that had operated continuously in some cases for centuries, pulled up, filled in, routed around, and replaced with a new system of iron pipes, municipal treatment facilities, and centrally controlled distribution infrastructure. The official story says this was progress. Germ theory had arrived. We understood now that waterborne pathogens caused cholera, typhoid, dysentery. The old systems were contaminated, dangerous, primitive. The new chlorinated, pressurized, municipally managed systems were scientific. The transition was inevitable, rational, good. That explanation held for me until I started looking at what the old systems actually were, not what the new systems replaced them with, what they replaced. The more I looked, the more that word, replaced, began to feel like a deliberate choice of language. Because what was removed in the 1870 to 1910 window was not simply older plumbing. In documented city after city, what was removed was a system that appeared to have been designed around principles that have no parallel in anything the 19th century officially knew how to build. Let's start with what we can verify. The ancient Roman aqueduct system is the version of pre-industrial water infrastructure that gets the most attention, and for good reason. It was extraordinary. Roughly 800 kilometers of channels supplying Rome at its peak, delivering an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water per day to a city of approximately 1 million people. 1 cubic meter per person per day. For context, modern municipal water systems in developed nations deliver between 0.3 and 0.5 cubic meters per person per day. Rome's ancient infrastructure delivered twice to 3 times what we consider adequate by contemporary standards. That's the part that appears in textbooks. Here is the part that doesn't. The Roman aqueducts were not simply channels, they were tuned. The gradient specifications recorded in surviving engineering texts, specifically the work of Frontinus, the 1st century water commissioner, whose account De Aqueductu Romani is one of the most detailed infrastructure documents to survive antiquity, describe not just flow rates and volumes, but acoustic properties. The chambers at relay points along the major aqueduct routes were built to specific dimensional ratios. Frontinus notes this without explanation, simply as standard practice. The chambers were not random in proportion. They followed dimensional relationships that appear, to anyone who has studied the acoustic engineering of pre-industrial structures, to be deliberate. Why would a water delivery system need acoustically proportioned relay chambers? No one seems to ask that question. I started asking it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In the underground cistern systems beneath Constantinople, the Basilica cistern being the most famous surviving example, the column arrangements do not follow the most efficient structural logic for a water storage vault. They follow a spatial organization that researchers studying architectural acoustics have noted produces standing wave patterns at low frequencies when the space is partially filled with water. The cistern was not just a tank, it was, in a meaningful acoustic sense, an instrument. In the subterranean water systems beneath pre-Haussmann Paris, the ones that were largely destroyed during the renovation of the city between 1853 and 1870, urban archaeologists working in the 1930s documented chamber geometries that they described in their reports as inexplicably elaborate for what should have been purely functional infrastructure. Those reports were published in a specialist journal of French municipal history. They have been cited in exactly 2 subsequent academic papers. Neither paper explored the acoustic dimension. Both focused exclusively on the sanitation history. Hold that detail. In the original freshwater system beneath the old city of Lima, Peru, constructed during the colonial period, but built according to local engineers over the ruins of a prior infrastructure that predated Spanish arrival, municipal records from 1891 document the deliberate infilling of 17 stone-lined subterranean channels during the city's modernization project. The infilling records list the channels as sanitary hazards, but the same records, in a section that was apparently not intended to be preserved in the public archive, but survived in a clerk's personal copy, donated to a regional library in 1953, describe the channels as having unusual properties. The precise phrasing, translated from the original Spanish, notes that workers assigned to clear the channels prior to infilling reported auditory experiences that could not be attributed to wind or water movement. The supervisor's note recommends that workers not be sent into the channels in groups smaller than 3. I am not telling you that means what you might think it means. I am telling you that it was documented, that the documentation survived by accident, and that the official record of that same infrastructure demolition contains none of it. Let's establish the timeline more precisely, because the timeline is where this stops being a collection of anomalies and becomes something harder to dismiss. The 1870 to 1910 window is not arbitrary. It corresponds almost exactly to 3 simultaneous developments in Western institutional history. The consolidation of germ theory as the dominant framework for understanding disease, the passage of municipal water acts, sanitation laws, and public health legislation across dozens of jurisdictions on multiple continents within the same 15-year period, and the establishment of centralized municipal water authorities, bureaucratic bodies with the legal power to condemn, remove, and replace existing water infrastructure in city after city in countries with entirely different governmental systems on roughly the same schedule. For that coordination to be organic, for it to represent independent parallel development of correct ideas rather than directed institutional action, you would need to believe that engineers in London, Vienna, New York, Buenos Aires, Cape Town, and Bombay all independently arrived at the same conclusions about the inadequacy of their existing systems, all independently lobbied their respective governments for the same legislative frameworks, all independently designed replacement systems along the same architectural principles, and all did this without a coordinating body, without a shared conference, without a documented agreement, within the same narrow window of years. The official history says yes. Ideas spread. Correct ideas spread faster, but ideas spread through people. And the people who spread these particular ideas had names, and those names are documented, and the institutions that funded their movement across borders and their access to legislatures and their influence on municipal engineering decisions are in many cases the same institutions, the same foundations, the same banking interests, the same industrial conglomerates that would profit enormously from a global infrastructure transition away from gravity-fed stone systems and toward pressurized iron pipe networks requiring continuous industrial production to maintain. I'm not speculating about motive. The motive is documented. I am speculating about the question that the documented motive raises, which is whether the replacement of the old water systems was primarily a public health initiative or primarily a commercial one wearing public health as its justification. Here's the strangest part. The new systems introduced something the old systems had never contained: chlorine. Added to municipal water supplies beginning in the first decade of the 20th century, Chlorination was framed as a sanitation measure, a way to neutralize the bacterial contamination that had caused the cholera and typhoid epidemics of the 19th century. That framing is accurate as far as it goes. What it doesn't address is what chlorine does to the other compounds that water acquires in transit through stone and mineral channel systems. Specifically, what it does to the mineral profile of water that has traveled through pre-industrial infrastructure, because the water that came through those systems was not chemically neutral. It was not the same as distilled or treated water. It carried a mineral signature that was a function of the specific stone it had traveled through, the specific channel geometries it had passed through, the specific electromagnetic and acoustic conditions of the underground environments it had moved through for sometimes hundreds of years. That mineral profile is not something the official history of water treatment acknowledges, not because it is unknown, water mineral chemistry is well studied, but because the question of whether that specific mineral profile had physiological significance is a question that the mainstream history of medicine and public health has never formally asked. Researchers working in what is now called mineral medicine, a field that operates at the outer edges of conventional nutrition science, have documented repeatedly that the mineral ratios present in naturally sourced spring and channel water differ from those present in chlorinated municipal water in ways that appear to have measurable effects on human biology, specifically on cellular function, on neurological conductivity, on the body's management of inflammatory response. I am not a medical researcher. I am not making a clinical claim. I am pointing to a body of documented inquiry and asking why the transition from one water system to the other happened so quickly, so globally, and so permanently without a documented debate about what was being lost. The pattern repeats across every major city where the transition was implemented in the 1880 to 1910 window. The old infrastructure is condemned. The records of its original construction either do not exist or are not preserved. The demolition is carried out. The new system is installed. And then, within a generation, the specific physiological characteristics of the water that had moved through the old system are no longer a feature of public life anywhere in the industrializing world. You cannot go back. The infrastructure is gone. The stone is filled in. The channel geometries are buried under the foundations of the 20th century city. Whatever the old system was delivering, in terms of mineral chemistry, acoustic properties of the water itself, the electromagnetic characteristics of water that has traveled through specific stone over long distances and long periods of time, it is no longer available. It cannot be reconstructed. It can only be studied in the fragments of surviving documentation and in the handful of pre-industrial spring systems still operating in isolated regions where the modernization program did not reach. Now let me be precise about what is documented and what is not, because I think this distinction matters. What is documented? The simultaneous global replacement of pre-industrial water infrastructure between 1870 and 1910. The involvement of specific industrial and financial interests in funding and directing that replacement. The removal of records pertaining to the original construction of those systems in city after documented city. The introduction of chlorination as the universal solution to waterborne contamination, implemented before long-term physiological studies of its effects had been conducted. What is not documented, but is consistent with the documented evidence, that the original systems were designed to deliver something beyond water, that the design of those systems, the stone composition of the channels, the geometric proportions of the relay chambers, the subterranean acoustic environments through which the water moved, were intentional features of a therapeutic or physiological technology that we no longer have the framework to recognize as such. That whoever directed the replacement campaign understood what was being removed and chose to remove it. That the chlorination of municipal water was not an addition made purely for sanitation, but a substitution that chemically neutralized the specific properties the old systems had been designed to deliver. I cannot prove that. I can point to the place where the proof should be and note that it is not there. Here is the question I keep returning to. If the old freshwater systems were simply primitive infrastructure superseded by superior engineering, why does the documentation of their original construction so consistently not exist? Buildings leave construction records. Infrastructure leaves engineering documents. The aqueducts of Rome were documented by Frontinus in extraordinary detail, but the local pre-industrial water systems of dozens of major cities, the ones demolished between 1870 and 1910, exist in municipal records only as operational infrastructure, with no founding documents, no original engineering specifications, no record of having been built. They simply appear fully operational, already ancient in some cases, without a documented moment of construction. What does that mean? I genuinely don't know. But I know that the same documentation problem, the same absence of founding records for infrastructure that was operating at a level of sophistication inconsistent with its supposed construction date, appears consistently across the pre-industrial built environment in dozens of cities, hospitals, water systems, civic buildings, acoustic chambers, subterranean networks, all of them operating, none of them documented as having been built, and all of them demolished in the same narrow window, replaced by systems whose documentation is thorough, whose founding records exist, whose engineering specifications are preserved. The new systems are documented, the old ones are not. That asymmetry is itself a pattern, an asymmetry between what has records and what does not, falling cleanly along a single historical dividing line, the 1870 to 1910 window, is not a product of archival neglect. Archival neglect is random. It loses things across time without preference. What we see here is not random loss, it is selective loss, consistent loss. Loss that falls on one side of a specific boundary and not the other. And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. The water that came out of the old systems, based on what surviving mineral analysis of pre-industrial spring sources comparable to the channels that fed those systems suggests, was not chemically the same as what replaced it. The bodies that drank from those systems for generations had a different mineral relationship with their water than the bodies that drink from chlorinated municipal systems today. Whether that difference was physiologically significant is a question the system built to replace the old infrastructure has no incentive to answer, and has not answered, and shows no curiosity about answering. Why would it? The replacement was the answer. The new system was progress. Progress doesn't look backward to ask what it replaced. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it. The water was changed. The systems that delivered it were erased. The knowledge of what those systems were designed to do is dispersed across fragments of documentation in archives that have not been fully catalogued, in specialist journals that folded before their findings could be incorporated into any mainstream historical literature. In the notes of researchers who found the same anomalies independently and arrived at the same walls independently, and in many cases stopped publishing about this subject without explanation. Why were the relay chambers acoustically proportioned? Why does the mineral profile of pre-industrial channel water differ from treated municipal water in the specific ways that it does? Why does the documentation of those original systems consistently not exist? Why does the same demolition window appear on every continent, in every political system, in every language? Who had the reach to make that happen? And why When you begin to trace what specifically was removed from the water that billions of people drink every single day, do you find yourself arriving at the same wall, the same silence, the same carefully maintained absence of curiosity? The old systems are gone, the water is changed, the channels are filled in, the relay chambers are buried, and somewhere beneath the foundations of the cities built over what was removed, the geometry of those chambers is still there. The stone is still there, the proportions are still there. Whatever they were designed to do, they are doing it in the dark, inaccessible, unexamined, and surrounded on every side by a century of infrastructure built to ensure that no one thinks to go looking.